Batman. You're gonna die.
What's wrong with you people?
Oh, ma.
How's it going, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Underrated Series. I'm Steve Cravens, and that is the one, the only, Andres Gallego, a.k.a. Gallegos.
Yeah, brother. Yeah.
By the way, we're well aware that NWO has nothing to do with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre whatsoever, but sometimes you just got to represent. So today we are talking about the, in our minds, criminally underrated and criminally disrespected 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which came out October 17th of that very year. It was directed by Marcus Nispel. That was actually his first film with Platinum Dunes, who was, they were Michael Bay's, and still are Michael Bay's production company with Brad Fuller and Andrew Form. It was their first venture into feature films. Andres, this is a movie that, I mean, listen, we both saw it when it came out in the theater. I still remember the online reaction to it even getting remade. Now, this is at a time when you and I were like 14, 13, however old we were at the time. I still remember the vitriol that was cast its way when it was announced that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was going to get remade. As a young teenager, I didn't understand the significance of why everyone was so upset. Now, where we are here 20 years later, I get it fully, considering that the original is my favorite horror movie of all time, if you don't consider Jaws a horror movie. Let me ask you this. When you saw it when it came out in 2003, what was your initial reaction to it? And did you see the original first before you saw the remake?
Yeah, so the original reaction that I had before seeing the 2003 remake was just that, again, hearing all that vitriol and hearing everybody just go, there's no way you can remake it. It was about as bad of a reaction as when Rob Zombie was announced to be remaking Halloween. It's like that. If there is a golden peak of horror, the Texas Chainsaw is automatically on the very top of that list. Like, it predates Halloween. It predated Friday the 13th. It predated Nightmare on Elm Street. Like, Leatherface is indelible in the horror community. And Tobe Hooper's direction and everything about that movie was just lightning in a bottle that I think it was a big task for any filmmaker to even come close to wanting to touch that peak. So honestly, the reaction to it was definitely, it was loud. Like, this is also 2002, 2003, when the internet was just barely in its infancies, and you could still hear it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you knew people were upset about this. But in terms of seeing the movie, I did see it opening weekend. And the other thing I did was I actually, I grew up in a small little conservative town over in Norwalk, Connecticut. And honestly, I saw every single horror movie back then. But for some reason, my Blockbuster never carried the original Texas Chainsaw. So that, I literally remember ordering the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre on DVD on Amazon, and I ordered it on a Monday, and it did not arrive until Friday afternoon. So I got to see the original literally a few hours before seeing the remake. And by this point, the remake had already kind of made me very curious about it because of the infamous tagline, based on a true story. You know what I mean? Which, it's only half correct. But yeah, so seeing the original right before seeing the remake, that was actually like a great 1-2 punch for me, because it was like, oh, now I see why everyone loves this movie. Granted, I thought the vitriol was a little overboard, and I thought, you know what, like, this one, out of a lot of other movies, I think could have stood to be remade, or had a chance of being remade with the modern sensibilities that we have today, with the style that we have today. And I thought the trailer for the original for the trailer for the remake of Texas Chainsaw had all that in spades right off the bat. So I was like, there is good ingredients for this movie to succeed, and I think we'll discuss it a little later. How much we think it succeeded. I mean, but we're on the underrated series on this one, so I think it's safe to say we both pretty much liked it, right?
We both liked it, and I loved it when it came out. When it came out, it blew my socks off, dude. I mean, that movie, it terrified me. I mean, obviously, it doesn't scare me now, but I mean, when I just turned 14, it scared the shit out of me. It's funny that the remake really kicked off the remake craze that happened in the early to mid 2000s for horror movies. Now, the very first one I can remember in terms of that era is that god-awful House on Haunted Hill remake that came out. But I don't really count that because that was even a couple of years before Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The success of Texas Chainsaw Massacre led to Platinum Dunes remaking Amityville Horror in 2005. I know people say remake, but it's really a reboot or a reimagining of Friday the 13th in 2009. And for those of you watching, we actually did a retrospective on that a couple of years ago. So if you haven't seen it, go ahead and check it out. Because both of us we go crazy for that movie. And I mean, obviously, Platinum Dudes didn't quite succeed at all with their remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Then you had Zack Snyder's badass remake of Dawn of the Dead. You had The Crazies being remade, which was actually written by Scott Kozar, who wrote the screenplay for Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Amityville Horror.
And also The Machinist.
And The Machinist as well. Fantastic movie. So the guy's a talented writer. I'm just saying that this movie, in its own way, was kind of influential for a whole generation of horror that saw a bunch of classics from the 60s and 70s and 80s get remade for a contemporary audience. Now, whether or not the movies lived up to the originals is up for debate. Most of them didn't. I actually think this one succeeded. I know you agree too. This one succeeded just in a different way. We got the same story, just with different twists and turns and a different sheen on it altogether.
I would say this movie far exceeds anything that's been done in the past 20 years. And also keep in mind, this movie is almost 20 years. No, this movie
it is 20 years old. Yeah.
And in that 20 years, we got the Texas Chainsaw 3D remake, which was actually Tobe Hooper actually put his seal of approval on that one, but that one was a piece of garbage in itself. And then the other one that came out, the Fede Alvarez Texas Chainsaw remake as well, that was terrible. The one that came out on Netflix is what I'm talking about. And then let's not forget Stephen Dorff's Leatherface movie, which was another remake in itself. And so clearly all these people that want to bash on the 2003 version for it being very Hollywood or whatever it is, very stylized. No, that's what gives this movie kudos, that they actually went in and they had care, they had love, they had a respect for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre brand. And I thought they did a superb job in terms of giving us, the audience, something that was much needed at that point in time, especially with Texas Chainsaw, where by that point, it was maybe 9 years since the next generation had come out, and that was frankly horrible as well. So, yeah.
So somehow Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger survived it. But honestly, when we're talking about this remake, and we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the cast and changes from the original and whatnot, but let's just focus on this remake for a second, because you mentioned it. In terms of the crew and the producers, the writers, Scott Kozar, everybody, Michael Bay, everyone involved, people like to bash Michael Bay, but at the end of the day, I think what he did was great in the sense that he did what Jerry Bruckheimer did for him back in the mid-'90s. When Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson hired him, he was a very hot, young commercial director and music video director. It was like him, David Fincher, Antoine Fuqua, oh God, I'm forgetting his name now. He directed Swordfish and he directed Gone in 60 Seconds. Dominic Sena. Yeah. And they were all part of the same group of guys who were directing commercials and music videos. And they were being touted by a lot of guys, Steven Spielberg included, were trying to get these guys to break into feature films. So Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson did that for Michael Bay with Bad Boys and then The Rock and so on and so forth. He wanted to do the same thing for younger directors who were involved in the music video world to kind of help them break into the feature film world by doing remakes, relatively low budget remakes of horror classics to kind of almost in a way guarantee a box office hit so you could kind of have a kickstart to your filmmaking career. Marcus Nispel was a great choice for this piece. If you go back and you watch his music videos that he's directed and some of his commercials, they're very, very stylized in a very grungy and dark and edgy way, almost kind of like how Alex Proyas and Darius Wolski shot The Crow in 1994. Some of his music videos from the early 90s look exactly like that. So that shows you how influential The Crow was.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no. And just even going further off that, I mean, like, you know, Marcus Nispel's entire run of stuff before Texas Chainsaw, like there's very interesting ways that he plays with light, smoke, fog, atmosphere, and they're all radically different from each other. And that is something that when you go into a horror movie, you want someone who knows what to do with a very small budget and make it look like $100 million, if that makes sense.
And the thing is that here's the thing about Marcus Nispel's feature film career is that it really kind of his two biggest hits were Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Friday the 13th. Okay. Conan the Barbarian, his remake of Conan the Barbarian flopped. Exeter nobody saw. Pathfinder flopped. So his feature film directing career kind of came and went, which is, it's too bad because his style is there. He just never really could figure out how to direct actors that well, but his visuals were incredible.
And keep in mind, Marcus Nispel is still doing music videos and stuff like that as well. And that's also just a thing that nobody, I mean, like when you see certain directors that disappear after like making one big hit and their music video directors, people are just like, oh man, you must not be working. It's like, no, actually for certain directors, like music video directors, like these people make so much making one music video that it's sort of becomes a question of why am I going to spend 9 months of my life making one movie when I can make a music video in 2 or 3 weeks and get paid exactly the same thing. So Marcus Nispel's still in the scene. It's just he's not been a feature director.
Yeah, he hasn't directed a feature film in 8 years. Mm-hmm. Which is, too bad because again, like, I mean, you look at his work and he knows what he's doing with camera, which brings me to this point. His frequent collaborator with these music videos, with these commercials is Daniel Pearl, who also was the cinematographer for the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So that in itself is insanely unique in the sense that you have the guy who shot the hallowed classic, the original, the one that the horror movie that guys like Wes Craven and Spielberg and Landis and Scorsese and Ridley Scott and Stanley Kubrick, you name it. I mean, the horror movie that people look to and be like, holy shit, this is a fucking horror movie right here. He shot that and he's shooting your remake, but it's the aesthetic is completely different. You would never know it was the same guy who shot it because obviously it was two different approaches. The original being more of a snuff film, a documentary style movie, very low budget, very gritty, very grainy, very kind of like, almost like someone stole a 16 millimeter camera and started killing people and filmed it. Or some creep was, in the house filming everything that was going on. Very disturbing. Whereas, like you said, the Hollywood early 2000s, aesthetic, if you will, the Marcus Nispel aesthetic with the smoke and the fog and like the heavy lighting and the in some ways super saturated and desaturated colors, depending on what scenes you're watching. It's very stylistic in its own way. And I think that was a brilliant choice because if he had tried to go with the similar aesthetic as the original, it would have flopped because the original is lightning in a bottle in terms of how it was made and how it looks and the movie that it is. To try to replicate that would be you might be able to pull it off. I'm just saying it was a much better decision to put your own stylistic imprint on the movie.
Yeah. And for a movie that was, I mean, I forget exactly what the budget was for the original, but the original was only shot for like, I think $80,000. That's
what so they say $80,000. Some people say $100,000. Some people say $180,000, which in the 1970s would translate to like what, $350,000 in today's money.
Yeah, but we'll never know exactly how much it made or how much it was worth because Bryanston Film Company, the mafia goons behind that one, they're not going to let us know those numbers at all. So there you go.
And unfortunately, a lot of the crew and a lot of the cast never really saw any and he reaps. It's too bad. It really is too bad. But I mean, we got a hell of a movie out of it. But man, the cast and crew really got screwed out of royalties for that.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, so that's what an approach that he took that was great. That he made it more slick, stylish, and polished than the original. It's a different aesthetic. It depends on which one you like more. Obviously, more people prefer the original.
Yeah.
But you had a bunch of questions that you wanted to talk about and topics you want to talk about regarding this remake. Before we do, I just want to say one thing in praise of Scott Kozar, the writer, when he was hired to do so he is a diehard horror fan and he's a diehard fan of the original. And I loved it when he said, when he was approached with it, he said that there was certain aspects of the original that you could not attempt to do again. One was the hitchhiker, and the second one was the infamous dinner scene at the end of the movie, or breakfast scene, depending on how you look at it. Technically, the scene takes place at like 5 a.m. But those were the two things that he realized, I can't write that piece. It's been done once, and to try to replicate it again, it would be not bueno. Let me try something else. So they do have a hitchhiker scene in this remake with Lauren German. It's just of a different variety. It's a different kind of hitchhiker.
Very different.
So there is a hitchhiker scene in the movie, just not what you were expecting. And there were some, well, anyway, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, I just wanted to praise Scott Kozar for that, because plenty of writers would think that they're good enough or talented enough or qualified enough to remake the movie shot for shot or to try to better on what's been done. And I'm not saying that writers shouldn't try to improve on what's been done, but it also takes a very self-aware writer to realize when something's been done to the best of its abilities the first time and to not fuck with it ever again.
Oh yeah, and also if you're going to remake something, you have to, the best way to remake anything is to sort of take the story and sort of retell certain events, not in necessarily a much different way, but it sort of feels like it might have been at the surface of the original. Like what Scott Kozar did with this film, where it's like, you know what, let's, certain things with the hitchhiker as well, and just even the family in general is radically different than the original from this film. And just trying to do a different look and a different aesthetic and a different cadence with the family members itself, that has to be praised for Scott Kozar, because all anybody could probably think of is, let's just redo Grandpa, let's just redo Dad, let's just redo Bubba all over again. Whereas he just said, you know what, we have to sort of try something a little different and try something that really no other remake has really done by that point as well. So, you know, I'm in full agreement with you that Scott Kozar is a very smart writer, and he's also a very esoteric writer as well, where, you know, just so much of his stuff is just so gloomy, uncomfortable, and it also deals with, in some way, shape, or form, just the your state of mind in terms of how depraved people can get, especially when you look at something like The Machinist, or you look at Amityville Horror, which to me, I think Amityville Horror is a superior remake than the original. Oh my God, yeah.
No, honestly, over time, I think a lot of people have, including myself, I agree with you on that, because the original is not that good. We might have lost some viewers with that, but the simple fact is, outside of Margot Kidder and James Brolin, it's horribly dated. It came out in 1979, 1980, something like. So yeah. There's movies that have come out before it that have aged far better due to the quality of the filmmaking. And then you look at that movie in 1979, 1980, and you're like, man, this has aged horribly. It does not. and you look at a movie like The Changeling from 1980, which came out around the same time.
Ooh, George C. Scott.
Yes, that has aged beautifully and is still unnerving and is still terrifying and still gets under your skin with its filmmaking. The seance scene is one of the best scenes I've ever seen in any movie, period. So the fact that the Amityville Horror original just doesn't pass that test, it's too bad. But yes, the remake is criminally underrated, and who knows, we might talk about it in a future episode. But anyway, great writer. And again, and hell, look at The Crazies, what he did with The Crazies, a movie that even by George A. Romero cinemaniacs who love his work are like, yeah, the movie's not very good. So he took a movie that wasn't very good and was like, all right, fine, fuck it, I'll make it. I'll take that concept, I'll take that movie, and I will make it better through the written page. And that is one of the best horror remakes of. I know it came out in 2010, barely, but I would consider it in the same era of horror remakes that came out, even though it's at the very tail end of it. I would consider it part of that group, if you will.
I would say it was definitely the beginning of the end for a lot of horror remakes.
For a lot, as a matter of fact, I think Let Me In came out later that year too.
Yeah.
So that was probably the last. That was probably the last one. But we can talk about it another time.
So on that same board of just all the stuff that Scott Kozar has done with the screenplay, one thing I really wanted to talk about is sort of the big differences between stylistically and also just plot-wise from the original all the way up into the remake. And I wanted to sort of see which one you think actually did a much better job of just upping the tension and just basically presenting us a much scarier story between the two. I mean, both of them work really well in their own ways, but I just wanted to know what you thought worked in each prospective movie.
So I don't want to. There's two ways I look at these movies. Okay, so in terms of building up tension, like you just said, the remake is more of a kind of a steady escalation of tension and dread, in the sense that I don't even know if that's fair to say, to be honest with you, because so the original takes much longer to get to where it's going. Okay, so we open up with that incredibly eerie and disturbing moment inside of the crypt or the grave where the hitchhiker is doing things with dead bodies that you probably don't want to know about, and taking pictures of the corpses and making art out of them and all that creepy shit that Ed Gein used to do. And then for a while, it's just we're following the teenagers in the van in the sweltering Texas heat in the middle of towards the end of the summer of 1973. And yes, the hitchhiker makes things very uncomfortable, makes things very edgy, keeps the audience on edge. But after that, there really isn't anything going on. They try to stop and get gas. They meet I thought it was the father of the group. It's actually the oldest brother of the bunch.
Yeah.
They can't find gas, which again was an issue in the 70s. Nobody ever had any gas in the early 70s. So that was very much of its time. And then, of course, the movie just ratchets up to such a high level of tension. Once Kirk walks through the entryway of the Sawyer house, you hear the pig squealing, and you see all the heads of the dead animals and the taxidermy on the wall. And then one of the greatest jump scares, possibly one of the most shocking moments in all of cinema, when Leatherface appears in the doorway, hits him over the head with the hammer. He starts convulsing, and then he hits him again, pulls him in, slams the metal door shut, and you have that great reverberating sound that goes throughout your sound system. And then you're in it right now. Like we have no idea what we're in store for. Whereas the remake, yes, the scene where the female hitchhiker, and again, this is kind of ridiculous, but there's no other way to talk about it, where she pulls the revolver out of her bleeding vagina and, spoiler alert, ends up putting the gun in her mouth and blowing her brains out, literally blowing the brains out. And they have that epic shot.
I was about to say that shot.
Through the mouth, through the back of the exit wound of the bullet coming out of the back of her head. Camera comes out of the hole, back out through the broken glass where the bullet exited through the vehicle, and comes right out, and we see everybody spill out, start puking and retching and all this stuff. Fucking fantastic. One of the best shots in any horror movie ever, period.
Oh, yeah. And I don't know if you've seen the outtakes for that scene in particular, but it's like, man, in order to get the timing on that so right, so many things had to go down at exactly the same point. And oh my God, that's one thing you have to give it up for Daniel Pearl and Marcus Nispel in terms of having that vision as well, too.
Oh, for sure. Well, what's funny? Okay, so in the original, the one shot that apparently a lot of filmmakers, including Steven Spielberg, Daniel Pearl actually said this in an interview when he was, I can't remember if he was working on a documentary or a behind-the-scenes featurette for one of Spielberg's movies, but when Spielberg found out who he was, that he shot Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the first thing Spielberg asked him was, how did you film the shot, the tracking shot that went underneath the swing and followed Pam to the front entryway of the house, and the house kind of looms large like a haunted castle as she's approaching the house? Apparently, a lot of filmmakers couldn't figure out how Daniel Pearl actually did that with laying the track underneath the swing set and tracking and following her as she walked up. I think it's great that the same cinematographer figured out a way to be like, dude, how did you how did you pull that shot off with the camera coming through the back of the head, through the, like, you know, starting off with the view out of the mouth, back of the exit wound, back of the freaking van, and then coming all, that was just fantastic. But not to wax poetic about it too much, but from that moment on, yes, there is a slow but steady buildup of dread. Clearly, there's something wrong in this remote little town. I can't remember if they're in West Texas, North Texas, South Texas, East Texas. They're somewhere in Texas. And clearly there's something wrong going on here. We're on edge. You know, they got to figure out what to do with the body. They end up calling the sheriff's office. And Arlie Irby,
Boy,
we can talk about Sheriff Floyd. We can do a whole episode of Sheriff Floyd, but we'll save it for later because I know you want to talk about the characters in the movie, so we'll save that for later. But let's just say that there is a steady buildup of tension in the remake, whereas the original more kind of is like this, and then all of a sudden jacks up like this.
And then progressively for the next act, it just becomes just one of the most uncomfortable experiences in all cinema. And I say it in the best way possible. I want to say the last 35 to 40 minutes, let's say, okay, fine, 45 minutes. Let's say the last 45 minutes of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the most harrowing experiences you can ever have watching a movie because it just keeps getting crazier and crazier and more. The original is one of the few movies I've ever seen, along with Eraserhead, that has the legitimate quality of nightmare, that you actually feel like you're watching someone's nightmare on screen. Oh, yeah. And the other thing, too, is that the original, it was shot to be a PG-rated movie, so they barely had any gore in it. And for a movie that doesn't have that much gore, it's a stunning achievement. I mean, again, you got to give Tobe Hooper, you got to give everybody on that cast, got to give them props for being able to do that. And also Gunnar Hansen as well, too, for defining that role. But I think we can get into that a little more.
Before we move on to the characters and the different interpretations, let me just say this real quick. In terms of what you're talking about, the intense experience, the building of dread, the tension and whatnot, this is one aspect of the original that the remake simply could not do just because it wouldn't be ethical. And it's not ethical that the original did it either, I mean, depending on who you talk to. But the remake, again, the sound design to the remake, once you hear Leatherface rev that chainsaw for the first time, when Kemper, again, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen these movies, why the hell are you watching this? But the Kemper's death, where he gets hit over the back of the head with the sledgehammer, that sound effect of the sledgehammer coming down the back of his head and cracking his head open, the blood hitting on the TV screen, and the little cartoon going, which is great. And then, of course, dragging him back in and closing the metal door. Great homage and great wink at the original for doing it exactly that way. But I don't know if you're aware of this. Tobe Hooper was involved in the sound design of the original, and the original doesn't really have a score per se. It's more kind of ambient noise and ambient, sound effects that kind of compose a movie score of sorts. Yeah. And one of the things he did, and the sound designers did, was they actually recorded the sounds of animals in an abattoir right before they got slaughtered. Ooh. So if you watch that movie, when you hear some of the metallic clanging and banging and the high-pitched squeals, and as a matter of fact, if you at the end of the movie, when Sally is literally going insane, and they're doing the extreme close-ups of her eye with the freaky veins and whatnot, and they're mocking her and driving her insane. If you listen in the background, you can hear the sound of pigs being slaughtered. Yeah. So that just adds another dimension to the movie of and also the commentary of these people slaughtering human beings as if they were cattle, as if they were, pigs that were just basically being killed and slaughtered for food. It really adds another completely batshit crazy dimension to that movie. But again, they're two totally different experiences, but they both ratchet up the terror in different ways that make for different but equally satisfying terror-filled experiences.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, like even as you're explaining that to me right now, I'm getting the shivers because I'm like, oh yeah, I hear all those sounds, and even the sound of Leatherface with that mallet in the original, I'm like, that seemed a little more different than anything. That actually seems like a real skull had gotten broken at some point. So yeah,
and I'll tell you a story right now just for the hell of it, even though we're talking about the remake. For those of you who don't know, I understand I used to live in LA for a long time, and I actually ended up going to the 40th anniversary screening of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre where Tobe Hooper and William Friedkin were there. This was obviously a couple of years before Tobe Hooper passed, probably like 3 years before he passed. Mm-hmm. And William Friedkin was doing a Q&A with Tobe Hooper. And he was asking for some behind-the-scenes stuff that we had never heard of. That, like, what's some stuff you can tell us about the movie that maybe no one who was involved with the production would know? And one of the things he said was, in the final scene, in the dinner scene, it was so ungodly hot there. They shot for over 24 hours. It was about 125 in that house with all the lights. The food on the table is getting gross. It smells. People are throwing up. And apparently they had, for a lot of props, they went down to a kill shelter for dogs and cats, and they picked up a lot of corpses for dogs and cats. And they had very inexperienced production assistants try to inject formaldehyde into the animal corpses so they could use them as props. Oh. And one of the PAs actually took a needle filled with formaldehyde and she stuck it into one of the dead cats, and the needle went through the cat into her leg, and she shot formaldehyde into her leg. Ooh. And so they said, well, obviously this is going to work. We have to get rid of it. They were like, well, what do we do all these dead dogs and cats? What do we do? Like, they're going to start smelling. They said, well, take them out in the back and burn them. What some idiot didn't realize was that he took the animal corpses and he put them outside and he lit them on fire. There was a draft that night and the wind was blowing the smoke from the corpses into the house. Oh no. Where they were filming. And they had to have the windows open because the heat in there was so unbearable. The smell from the food was so unbearable that they had to have the windows open because of how hot it was. And the smoke with the smell of the corpses of the animals is coming into the room where they're filming, and people were just throwing up. As a matter of fact, Edwin Neal, who played the hitchhiker, said he served in Vietnam. And he said that serving in Vietnam was a cakewalk compared to those last several days on Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And that if he ever saw Tobe Hooper again, he'd kill him. That's how insufferable those conditions were while they were making it in the summer of 1973. So I just thought that was a delightful story to tell you guys about the original movie.
Oof. I mean, you tell me that story. I just only have one thing to say. Thank God for unions.
Yeah. You cannot get away with that shit anymore.
No, not get away with that
shit anymore. But anyway, I mean, back to the remake, which we love, and I feel like we need to start praising more than we already are because we're waxing poetic about the original. This is about the remake. So, Andres, go ahead, ask your next question.
Yeah, so I was going to ask as well, too. I mean, we were going to go into this as well, but the differences between the cast of the remake and the original, like, there's no slight on the original whatsoever, apart from Gunnar Hansen, who did Gunnar Hansen and, oh my God, Grandpa and the older brother and the hitchhiker. Apart from the main four, I thought everybody else was like, okay, Sally was a little shaky. Franklin was a little shaky as well, too. But I think arguably the cast in the remake, I think, is very well-rounded all the way through. And so for me, I just wanted to ask what your opinion was between the two cast members and between the two. And then we'll get into it later between the two leather faces between the remake and the original, which is Gunnar Hansen and Andrew Bernarski in the remake.
Okay, so I think that the original cast is much more effective in the sense that it's not, you look at Jessica Biel and you look at who's a Mike Vogel, is that it? Mike Vogel and
Jonathan Tucker.
Jonathan Tucker's in it. Erica Learson's in it. Anyway, you look at it's like someone took a cast from the early 2000s and then it was like, okay, we're going to put a bunch of 1970s, costumes on you, and then we're just somehow going to pretend that you're in 1973. They do a very good job. Now, hold on, don't get me wrong. They do a very good job. However, the cast for the original is much more effective for the type of movie that they made in the sense that the original is supposed to come off as a documentary. You're not supposed to look at these people as actors. You're supposed to look at them as people that are just going about, their day in, a hot summer day in Texas. They're not supposed to be acting per se. And if you look at what Marilyn Burns, her screaming and her performance in the last half of that movie, it's phenomenal. Now the remake cast, obviously, Arlie Ermey is fucking incredible. He's like a perfect blend of the hitchhiker and the old man from the original put into one character. But I think Jessica Biel does a very good job I think Edmund Kemper, sorry. not the serial killer. Kemper is the name of the character. It's Edmund Kemper. Well, we are talking about serial killers, so it's perfect. But
Eric Balfour.
Eric Balfour, who plays Kemper, he was very good as well. I actually think out of the bunch, Jonathan Tucker is the best one out of the bunch because he actually had kind of like a smart ass, kind of kind of a pain in the ass kind of character, and yet he's the only one in that movie who has the freaking common sense to be like, guys, nothing about this sounds good, and we should get the hell out of here. Like this is giving me bad vibes. We should go right now. Even when the little kid Jediah shows up. All the other ones are just like, oh, where'd you come from? What's your name? He's like, dude, fuck that. Look, we got to get out of here. Forget the dead body. Let's get out of here. Jonathan Tucker is fantastic in that movie. And his scene with Hoyt in the back of the van where they're trying to recreate what happened and he's forcing him to put the gun in his mouth. He actually forced himself to throw up. So every take when he was shoving the gun into his mouth, he was forcing himself to gag on the gun to get the puke going, which is dedication that I certainly wouldn't have.
This is why we're not actors.
Not actors, but he is fantastic, and the remake cast is I feel like their performances have aged better over time. I feel like if more people who saw it when it came out and weren't impressed by it or simply dismissed it as another Hollywood remake, even though it shouldn't be fair to be called another Hollywood remake considering it was the one that really kind of kickstarted that wave, as we discussed. Time has been very kind to their performances and to the movie in general. So I think that for what they're trying to do, a very Hollywood movie, they got fantastic performances from everybody. I don't think there's a single weak link in the cast, actually, as a matter of fact. So yeah, it's totally different purposes. You have a bunch of amateurs and local theater actors, acting majors in the original whose job was simply to be as natural as possible. Yeah. Whereas the remake cast is kind of acting their asses off, and it's very clear that they know they're in a horror movie, but they still come off as very, very believable, relatable, and for my part, when they do start getting killed off one by one, you actually do feel it, because I do think that they were very, very likable and very relatable.
Absolutely. I feel the same exact way. I mean, that's just also the way that I feel about the Friday the 13th remake, is that when you lose somebody in that remake cast, it actually kind of does sting, and it surprises you in so many ways. I mean, like even when Kemper is the first one out of the bunch to basically get his head bashed in, and you don't expect that kind of, because you're kind of like, all right, maybe it's going to be the smart ass, or maybe it's going to be the Mike Vogel character who's just like, oh, I'm just here, and I'm making out with Pepper in the beginning of the movie and all this other stuff. But the guy who seems to sort of have everything in control and be the leader of the group, you don't expect him to go out first, which I thought was really great. And then just some of the scenes later on where you find Andy in the basement being hung up on the meat hook, and he's begging Aaron to basically just put him out of his misery. And it's one of those things where they don't, like in the original, we don't necessarily follow the victims after they've met Leatherface for a little bit, or just the victims in the house, if that makes any sense. Like we get little glimpses here and there, whereas this one we get the scenes of like Andy trying to escape from the meat hook, or like him just basically, or like Leatherface, like salting his wound and all that other stuff, and like trying to cauterize it and all the other shit. Like it feels like we get to spend more time with the victims in this house than we do in the original, which again, the original is trying to do something way different, which is, we follow everybody as they come along, and our mind is sort of supposed to just connect what has happened to them previously. Whereas this one, I think, did a great job in terms of building everybody up, so that by the time Aaron sticks that knife into his stomach, you're like, yeah, no, I get it. He's tried everything. There's no way out of this, and he's not running out of there either. So I thought that was a really great thing that they did. Now, the big gun that I really want to talk about is the two portrayals between Gunnar Hansen's Leatherface and Andrew Bernarski's Leatherface. And right off the bat, I will say both of them are really great in so many respects. They're very complimentary for the movies that they're in. Like, I argue it's sort of like in the same way of Jack Nicholson's Joker and Heath Ledger's Joker, where they both work really well in their own movies. But if you take them and you switch them with each other, they don't work. So right off the bat, Gunnar Hansen did an amazing job in terms of portraying Leatherface as sort of this, Arrested Development type of character where, he sort of has like the whimsy of a child in terms of
the character is, mentally impaired.
Oh yeah, he is, but that sort of leads you to a little bit of there's a little innocence in him, dare I say, in terms of the moment where he's just sort of sitting there and he's like, no.
Yeah, I see what you're saying with that, and it's. I'll push back and say this. I do agree that Gunnar Hansen's Leatherface would not fit in with the remake. I actually think Andrew Bryniarski's Leatherface would fit in just fine in the original. I actually think that his wrecking ball, savage dog, portrayal of Leatherface would have been right at home in the original because it would have fit that atmosphere. But I'll tell you this much. I do like how, in a strange way, both movies, even though Leatherface is obviously the main villain of both of the original and of the remake, they made him mentally impaired. They made him kind of an inbred brother of the bunch. Okay, and they kind of make it, even though what he does is horrific, he also makes it seem like he's also not aware of what he's doing. He's getting bullied around by his two older brothers.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? Like he's a simpleton. Like his sole focus is to kill people that come across, and they make food out of him, and that's that. And there is a kind of tragic thing to him that he's basically he's almost kind of like a Hunchback of Notre Dame kind of character. He's kind of like Quasimodo in that sense that he's deformed and he's the brunt of a lot of mean jokes, and that actually applies to Bryniarski's portrayal in the remake, where he got some sort of rare skin disease and started eating away at his face, and the kids started making fun of him, and that's basically where that rage started to come from, is that he was belittled and humiliated as a little kid. Obviously we see in the movie that his face is indeed, like he's missing his food and all that stuff. We see like how kind of deformed he is physically. We don't know if that story that his sister tells Aaron is true, but why not? We've seen the evidence that he is, disfigured. So kids probably did, abuse the hell out of him. So you get a background to this character for both movies that's very effective and understandable, if not condonable, of what they do. Obviously, you're not going to condone this guy going around hitting people over the head with a sledgehammer, chainsawing them, cutting off their legs, putting them on meat hooks. You're not condoning that. Obviously, that's horrific and it's disgusting. However, you're also realizing that the person that's doing this clearly has impairments and has mental illness that is compelling him to do these things, not to mention families that are demented and psychotic that enable them and encourage them to do these things. Which makes Leatherface, in my opinion, one of the most interesting and complex slashers, if you will, because he does have both versions, the remake and the original, very, very traumatic and very unfortunate, a very unfortunate background. And obviously, we're not talking about the prequel to the remake, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, at the beginning, but that his background is even further expounded upon in that movie. So you can see how messed up that was from that film as well. But anyway, that's getting back to your original question, which I believe is, comparing, contrasting the two. This might be a cop-out, Andres, but I really don't think that there's one clear, better, or more effective performance over the other one. That I just think that you're right. Each performance is totally appropriate for the movie that they're featured in. And the tone of the movie perfectly. I don't want to cop out, but I do believe that's the correct answer.
No, but it's that's the correct answer. But also on top of that, it's great to be able to highlight a positive of one movie and to highlight the positive aspect about, the remake. I mean, in terms of like how you said, Andrew Bryniarski is just this vile. I mean, probably the best way he's been described is this is a Leatherface who knows what he's doing and who enjoys what he's doing and who's more tenacious. and he's out for revenge. He's not as much of a little kid as he is in the original. This one is one that loves doing what he's doing. And when you look at the family, which we'll get into that in a second, when you look at the family in the remake, all of them who are screaming, did anyone care about my boy when all this stuff was happening? It's like, yeah, when you have a family unit that's pretty much just rage filled and feels like they've been ostracized from the world, yeah, Leatherface is going to be a little more angrier than most. Whereas you look at the family in the original, they're just kind of like, wow, you just kind of came into my path. Like, they just sort of seem like as if, like, if you just passed by them, they would have probably have left you alone. But you did go into their house, and you can't be left alive after that. But
yeah, it is interesting though, isn't it? How in the sense, like, yeah, if you had driven by, they probably. Well, no, that is true. Kurt's the one who knocked on the door, heard squealing, and still, even though he said hello, hello, and he didn't get an answer, he decided to go into that house. And then Pam does the same thing, and then fucking Jerry does the same thing, and then Franklin and Sally, end up looking like Hansel and Gretel out there in the woods. Anyway, so yeah, it is, and actually, it is. Andrew Braniarski's Leatherface is actually kind of comparable to Derek Mears' Jason in a couple of different ways. But anyway, we've talked about that movie, but let's move on. But
Scott Cozart did a great job in reinterpreting the family, because it's so easy to have said, let's recast the hitchhiker, let's recast. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting what the older brother's name is, Grandpa, and
I think they call it. I think it's just the old man. I think is the name. I think there's Grandpa, and then so I do believe it's the old. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, but even so far as to like actually make the unit in the remake feel like this oh my goodness, this eclectic group of gypsies that have all been like smashed together, and they don't look anything alike. The only thing that really kind of unites them is the fact that they are all beings that feel like they're ostracized from humanity at that point. And honestly, and also even adding the little bit of a layer with the woman who appears to be Leatherface's sister, whereas she's a part of there was a massive thing of child abductions back in the 70s, and they really touched on that in this movie. And it also really goes to make you question, is Jedediah actually like really a part of their family, or was he sort of just inherited? I mean, I know the buck teeth sort of give it away, but who knows, man? Who knows?
Well, that's actually an interesting thought that I never even thought of. Is Jedediah part of that family, or was he abducted from former victims? That is an interesting question. That's an interesting question that I had never thought about. So thank you for giving more complexity and dimension to the movie. No, because seriously, I know what you're saying. Oh, the buck teeth kind of give it away, but it never really occurred to me that that's actually a possibility. I'll say this: the original family, the crazy lunatic cannibals that they are, very kabuki, and I mean that in the best way. Very over the top, but like one of the best things about the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the dark humor in it. And a lot of people don't catch it the first time because you're so freaking overwhelmed by what you're watching. Like, holy shit. But like you start to see like some of the stuff that's said at the dinner table. It's honestly like a really dysfunctional Thanksgiving dinner. Like, he doesn't do anything. He's just the cook. And just shut up, you pig hog. I mean, like the bickering that goes back and forth. And even when they come back through the door and they see that Leatherface has cut open the door, look what your brother did to the door. Like, it's hilarious. I mean, some people not appreciate it, but they are very over the top and very kooky, kind of crazy, cartoony characters. Whereas in the remake, it's even with Hoyt, it's much more, like I said, rage filled. With the old man in the wheelchair missing his legs, with the old Monty, I think old Monty.
Yeah, old Monty is his name.
Old Monty, the sister, Leatherface's mother. You get the sense that they really, like you said, have been completely and utterly left behind by society. Again, you get more into it into Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning, but assuming you've never seen that, just going by what's inferred by their performances is they're not. They might be crazy. They might have lost their minds by being isolated and by committing heinous acts of murder and kidnapping children, kidnapping newborns, and whatnot. It's a much more unnerving experience watching the Remake family in the sense that, because they're not as cartoony, because they're not as over the top, and they're much more cold and calculating and threatening in that way, and much more almost kind of like a more realistic. If this were to ever happen, what would a family like that be like if you were to encounter a homicidal family like that? They probably would end up being more like the Remake's portrayal of the family as opposed to the original. Who knows? I hope I never find myself in that situation ever to find out. But I do think that the whole unit as the family, how they're written, how they were acted, I think it's fantastic. They're definitely a highlight of the movie for sure.
Oh, yeah, they're definitely a highlight of the movie. And never once during the remake did I ever miss the hitchhiker or the old man or grandpa. This felt like something different. The only one we would have probably missed had they not remade it would have been Leatherface. But, you can't change that guy. But I will say the one thing that made, for me, the Remakes family work really well was the fact that in all the stuff that they're doing, they don't feel that whatever they're doing is wrong. They feel like as if they're actually bringing balance to the world. They're actually doing the right thing, if that makes sense, which is even scarier. And in comparison with the original, it's like, this is what we got to do in order to live. This is what's happening. And then, you look over in the remake and it's like, what? Fuck everybody else. We're getting rid of the scum. But I feel we would be very remiss if we didn't talk about R. Lee Ermey as the sheriff. So, I mean, to me, as great as everybody else is, R. Lee Ermey steals the movie in so many respects.
He's probably the main reason to watch it. Just like R. Lee Ermey stole damn near everything he was in. Who doesn't watch Full Metal Jacket and just like get blown away by his performance, especially since he was an actual drill instructor. But he is perfectly cast in this movie. Apparently, he did do the written dialogue, but he improvised a lot of dialogue too for his character. Once he said, like he said, I believe he said in the making of documentary on the DVD that he likes to tailor make each bad guy that he portrays. So he'll get a grasp on the character with the written script. And then once he kind of formulates what the character is, then he'll start improvising. He's not disrespectful and just starts improvising right away. Like he waits to like talk to the writer and talk to the director and get like, should I go more this way or that way? Like, what do you think about the character doing this and that? And then once he has the grasp, that's when he starts doing it. And he's just absolutely, like I said, Kozar was smart enough not to write in the hitchhiker character from the family in this movie, but we got an equally iconic and memorable performance from R. Lee Ermey as Sheriff Hoyt in this movie. That's just as terrifying and just as darkly humorous as the hitchhiker.
Oh yeah, I mean, just even going to the scene where they're wrapping up the hitchhiker and just all the craziness that comes out of his mouth, and you're just like, oh my God, like you just feel for Andy being right next to that dude as you're wrapping up a dead body. And he's talking about, back when I was a young patrolman, I used to love wrapping up these honeys. And you're like, oh my God, what is this guy? This guy is not the sheriff.
What are they using? Just like saran wrap?
Saran wrap. It's not even like a body bag. It's saran wrap.
It's just ridiculous. I mean, everything that he says in that movie, and again, I said darkly humorous too. That's kind of like the darkly humorous part of the movie where like he says things that are just so disgusting and like out of this world that you're just like, you have no choice but to laugh just because it's so freaking ridiculous. But he turns it on a dime later in the movie where all of a sudden that dark humor goes right out the fucking window and he just turns into a sadistic maniac. He turns into like, a Ted Bundy, Charles Manson type where, like, oh yeah, it's all fun and games in the daytime. And now once I have you guys at night and you've already lost, like you said, the alpha male of the group, or two males actually, they lost Kemper and they lost Andy. So now it's just Jonathan Tucker and it's Jessica Biel and Eric Learson left in the movie. So that's what makes it even more intense, is that now they're even like, now it's like, oh no, now you've lost two guys that were part of your original party. Now it's just the three of you and this guy with a gun, and he's forcing you to do things that, you know, no normal cop would ever do. But he is fantastic. I mean, he just a huge loss to have lost him, but I'm so glad that he did this movie, because he makes it so much more memorable. I can't think of another actor who could have been cast in that role and done as good a job with the material as he did.
Oh yeah, no, he was easily a standout of the remake and of the beginning. So, you know, kudos to him. But God, it was such a really great portrayal. And then just the idea of the fact that in this lawless place, or in this barren desert of a place, the only one solace that you're supposed to have is in the law enforcement, and that's
taken away. Taken away. You have no safety net in this world. It's gone. Like, you are on your own. And that's another level that makes it. So we've talked about the cast, we've talked about the characters, we've talked about the style of the movie, we've talked about a lot of things with the original and the remake. But one thing we haven't talked about yet is the difference in gore between the remake and the original, and I guess I should say the lack thereof of the gore from the original to the remake. So let me ask you this. That was also another thing that I was actually kind of impressed by. Roger Ebert less so, because in his 0-star review, he said it was a miserable experience watching the movie, where it was just all about pain and suffering. And he's not wrong. It just turns out that Roger Ebert just wasn't a masochist like the rest of us. So when you think about the remake, what's some of the more gnarly, or what is the most gnarly scene in the remake that you think of?
Oh my goodness, there's so many really gnarly scenes in the remake. I mean, like, first off, the scene where Andy gets his leg chopped off by Leatherface during the chase. That, I mean, like, that is pretty harrowing in itself. But then also the scene, I mean, again, Kemper getting his head bashed in, and but probably one of the big ones for me, and I almost forgot about talking about this moment, is the scene where you see the Belfer mask, where you see Kemper. His face has been torn off, and Leatherface is actually wearing his face, which we've never seen in the Texas movie by that point. And we're like, oh, I mean, of course that would have happened. But then the scene where all of a sudden you see Jessica Biel's like reaction to seeing her boyfriend's face on this maniac, and you can so clearly tell that it's his face, that you're like, oh crap. It's like that in particular is probably one of the more impressive moments. But also even Andy's impalement on the meat hook as well too is pretty damn gnarly. So yeah, there you go.
Trying to get him off, and then him sliding further back down it, and then realizing you're not freaking going anywhere. One of the shots that always stands out to me is when Andy's getting carried down the stairs into the basement. He tries to grab the walls, and his nails peel off as he's getting dragged down. I mean, the movie is a little extreme. And also, I mean, listen, I mean, Jonathan Tucker must have been thrilled when he was told that the way he was going to bite the bullet was that he was going to get strung up on a chandelier, and that Leatherface was going to take the chainsaw and rip upwards through his balls and his dick, into his pelvis and into his lower chest. And actually, in one of the deleted scenes, they show all the gore that was supposed to happen while the gloop's starting to come out.
Yep.
They decided not to use it for obvious reasons, because it never would have made it into the movie. And also, it was kind of didn't really look the best anyway. But that's also one of them. But man, I mean, Michael Bay said that his goal when he agreed to produce this movie was that he wanted to go back to the old school horror movie, which meant raw and real and whatnot. And I know we talk about how stylish the movie is, but in terms of the gore, in terms of the kills, they are very raw. They are very real. And when, I mean, hell, even like we talked about in the beginning of the vid, when she, you know, the hitchhiker blows the back of her head out, you see the brains go all over the freaking the back of the window in the van, and then you know, Andy makes a remark, I guess that's what brains look like, huh? Sort of like lasagna, a little bit. All right, I'll shut up now.
Which comes back later on during the scene where oh my goodness, Jonathan Tucker's character is in the van with Arlie Ermy, and then he's like, I need you to sit right there. And he's like, oh, does a little blood scare you? And then all of a sudden you look out and he swipes away bits of brain. And it's like, that's not blood, that's brain matter. Jesus Christ.
And you know, and that is, it goes to show you that two different styles can work because, yes, this movie is much more graphic, much more violent than the original. However, because that they insisted on showing you every last thing that happens with every kill or every single time someone gets maimed or tortured or whatever, because it leaves less to the imagination, in some ways it's less effective. Because I do think it's hilarious that Hooper filmed the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre with a PG rating in mind because he wanted to have as big of an audience as possible. The fact that he filmed most of the violence off screen, except for Kurt getting hit over the head, and I guess Jerry taking the sledgehammer to the face, and even Pam getting put on the meat hook. You never actually see the hook going through her back.
Yeah,
and you don't see any gore going into the wash tub that's placed underneath her. We figured it out. Like, she's on a meat hook. There's a wash basin beneath her, and it's meant to catch blood and intestines and body parts and whatever else is supposed to, even though we see her in the freezer, a little bit later. And that's actually a pretty horrific way to die too, being placed in the freezer and suffocating to death or freezing. Like that's a bad way to go too. But anyway, so it's very, very interesting how two different filmmaking approaches created very different and effective movie-going experiences for their audiences. Because obviously, the days of not showing your audience everything, to be honest with you, I can't think of a horror movie in recent memory that went out of its way to leave things up to the audience's imagination. You see, there's blood when, especially when Franklin's getting cut up in the wheelchair, you see blood shooting out onto the apron that Leatherface is wearing. You see blood on Kurt's face when he gets hit with the hammer. But otherwise not too, and also, one of the more effective things when Leatherface cuts open Sally's finger for Grandpa to suck on. They actually cut Marilyn Burns' finger because the tube on the back of the knife wasn't working. So they did slit open her finger in that shot. So, and again, that little cut of blood is effective enough on its own, because most of us, I don't know about you, but the thought of getting a finger prick when I go to the doctor is like, fuck you. I hate needles. So like the fact like someone's slitting open my finger, it's like, fuck you. Like that's horrible. That's I mean, I'm not saying that I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake isn't horrible. I'm just saying that like it's still effective in its own way. That's all I'm trying to say. Two different approaches to gore and violence done very effectively for what they're trying to do.
Again, we didn't have to be told nearly as much back in the 70s. And there was also the sense that they really took leaps of faith with the audience in terms of like, there was not necessarily a moment where someone is ingesting human meat in the original, but it's more or less just implied, and it's very, very, very close to the surface level. I mean, like, you see all sorts of evidence that you're like, oh yeah, these people are cannibals. And you see the furniture, you see the lampshades, you see everything. And knowing what we knew back then with Ed Gein, that was something where the audience was able to make that distinction, to make that connection between, oh God, these people are actually getting eaten at the end of the day.
They also, they're not as overt about it in the remake, but it's hinted at in the remake too. I think old Monty says, maybe she stay for supper. Like that one line, like we figure out what's going on here. The other thing about this particular remake that was very influential is that it made R-rated remakes, R-rated horror movies very popular going forward. Horror movies back in the early 2000s were still very much marketed to teenagers. They were PG-13 movies, meant to generate, huge amounts of box office in the opening weekend, and then they'd fade away. And then before you knew it, you were seeing them in the freaking $1 bin at Walmart. I mean, the most famous of which is the Ring remake. Okay, that made an insane amount of money back in 2002. This movie showed that it was okay to take the gore and to take the violence to the next level, and that the movies could still make money. That they could make absurd amounts of money, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre, regardless of what you think about it, the remake anyway, it was hugely profitable enough to justify a prequel 3 years later. And then got the ball rolling with Amityville Horror and other movies that came on, down the line. So I think time has been kind to this movie. I think that people who haven't seen it in a long time need to go back and rewatch it, because yes, it's interesting how the movie takes place in 1973, and they do their best with the production design and the clothing to make it seem like that's the case. But it is very much a movie from the early 2000s. It's got 2003 written all over it, and yet that makes it much more endearing in its own way, in the sense that, like, you know, it's funny. I forgot who said that, like, you know, some movies come out and they're automatically dismissed as garbage or trash or unnecessary. And then 10 years go by and all of a sudden people started looking at it differently. And then 15 years go by and more people start appreciating them. You know, 20 years go by. And before you know it, everybody all of a sudden has done a complete 180 and appreciates it because it's so much different than what we're getting today. I know Blumhouse is doing their thing with the Halloween movies. Yeah. And I know that we're getting the Exorcist movies. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The less said about that, the better. So I know that there's R-rated remakes and sequels and all this other stuff coming out. But back then it was a novel idea to do a remake of a horror classic like that. Even though Gus Van Sant, you know, 5 years previous, decided to do a shot-for-shot remake of Psycho, which is like, why even bother? Why even do? If you're going to remake Psycho, if you're going to remake Perfection, just go all out and balls to the wall and just do it from scratch. Why are you doing it shot for shot, line for line, man?
I think he did a $120 million experiment, and you know what? He proved a point. You could literally take the same exact movie and you cannot duplicate it, no matter how hard you try.
If you think about it, in terms of the great horror remakes that came out around that time, we talk about Dawn of the Dead, we talk about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Most of them have fallen by the wayside. Nobody talks about them anymore. So I think that shows Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's not timeless. It's not a masterpiece. It's not perfect, but it is memorable. And when you've remade an iconic cult masterpiece like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think that's the highest praise you can get. You remade a movie that many consider to be perfect, including Quentin Tarantino, and you made it its own thing. You put your own spin on it, and it is memorable.
Mm-hmm.
That's just that is my final thought on that.
It is memorable, and it's far better than any of the sequels we've gotten in the past 20 years for the Texas Chainsaw. I don't think anyone would be willing to argue that this would not at least make the top 3. I mean, you look at that franchise, and like, as much as we love the original, it's not that high of a quality of a franchise given everything that we've gotten. Whereas I don't think anybody could really argue, given what we've gotten within the past 15 years, that this movie doesn't hold up, and it doesn't at least try to be respectful to the moniker of Texas Chainsaw. So this one absolutely really holds up well, even still this day. I mean, the original is timeless in its own way. This one, I think, is probably one of the more easily watchable out of the entire franchise.
I agree with you. And again, like you said, it's not like it's that high of a bar to like set for this franchise. It's amazing. It's kind of like the Jaws movies in that way. Like the first one was an utter masterpiece. Second one has its moments, and then after that, it starts getting. Yes, Jaws 3 has the scene where Fitzroy gets swallowed whole, but otherwise it's a completely forgettable movie. It's the same Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. They just get progressively worse and worse. And yes, I mean, the remake is not only better than any of the sequels that came after the original, it's also better than any of the prequels or sequels that came out after it. So I guess in summary, the reason why we do these videos is to try to convince you guys or remind you guys of certain movies that have fallen to the wayside and have either gotten disrespected or, just forgotten. And I think that this movie deserves a second chance. If you can rent it on iTunes or wherever, if you have it on Blu-ray, if you can get it on Blu-ray, however way you can see this movie, it's worth checking out. It's aged terrifically. And I think that as the years continue to go on, its reputation and its image will continue to rise and rise and rise. And I can't say that for a lot of horror remakes that came out around that time, or any remakes that come out these days. I can't think of any memorable remakes that we've had. I mean, seriously, think about it. I mean, like remakes, that was a whole phase that just got phased out. And we had, for every Let Me In or Dawn of the Dead or The Crazies or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we had, God knows how many just piss poor. I mean, remember The Fog?
I was about to say, how many of those remakes were all remakes of John Carpenter movies?
Fog, man. I mean, And then you had great remakes that came along that had nothing to do with horror, like Peter Jackson's King Kong. You had Martin Scorsese's The Departed. There was, anyway, we could do a video strictly on remakes, but anyway, I think this is the perfect way to end it, is that it is worth checking out. It has aged well, and it separated itself from the original, and that itself makes it worth existing. That justifies its existence, that it went different enough, yet paid homage at the same time to become its own thing while still being very much a remake of the 1974 movie.
Absolutely. And to even add on top of that, I mean, anybody who seeks this movie out, I would also say go seek out the 2-disc collector's edition for Texas Chainsaw as well, too, which they have an amazing documentary about the making of the film, in which, you can actually hear it in the filmmakers are like, we know we were treading on hollow ground with this point, and we tried our best, and I think they really succeeded in that way. I believe it's on the Blu-ray as well, so there you go.
It is, and I believe it's on YouTube as well. There's bits of it that are on YouTube too. So if you can't get your hands on the DVD or Blu-ray, check out YouTube, because I think that'll also give you, making of documentaries tend to give you a better appreciation for all the hard work that goes into it. Sometimes we just watch movies and take it for granted. We don't, remember the hard work that goes into making these things.
Yeah.
But it's a fantastic remake, and in my eyes, every year that's gone by, it's just gotten better and better.
Yeah.
Anyway, Andres, do you have any parting thoughts or anything else you'd like to say?
Great remake, and honestly, if what this remake really did was it really announced Platinum Dunes as like, a really up and comer in terms of giving a chance to indie filmmakers to sort of make their bones, and they're still around even to this day as well. I mean, like they gave John Krasinski his own startup to basically make A Quiet Place, and I think that really worked out really well for all of us. So honestly, this movie has done a lot. Given the fact that there's certain things that are not perfect about it, it did give the rise to Platinum Dunes, and in terms of all these filmmakers coming up and about, and then it gave us A Quiet Place 20 years later. So honestly, everything started with this film, and it's like you said, it's aged really well.
It has. And one more thing about Platinum Dunes, I actually met Brad Fuller. I had a meeting with him back in 2014, and I got to ask him about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. He actually had a big what do you call it, a theater stand-in, where those big cardboard things, that you see in the lobbies of movies.
Oh yeah, standees.
He had that in his office, and he said, that's not my favorite movie that we ever produced, and he actually said the Friday the 13th remake was his favorite movie they produced. But he said that movie will always have a special place in my heart, because it was my first time as a fully fledged producer making this movie happen and making it a reality. And there's a magic to it that, I do think that and keep that in mind. Yes, Michael Bay was a producer. Yes, he was experienced, but for the most part, he was a producer in name for the most part. He did have a hand in hiring Marcus Nispel, but it really was Andrew Form and Brad Fuller that really kind of pushed this movie into getting made. And their respect for the original really comes through, just like Scott Kozar's respect for the original really comes through. So check out the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake from 2003. That's Andres Gallego, a.k.a. Gallegos. I'm Steve Cravens. This has been the Underrated Series. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.